I'm Rainey Mullen, and this is Pen and Poet. Intimate conversations and performances with poets, both page and stage, established and up and coming. A safe space where you can meet new artists, maybe gain an appreciation for the spoken and written word. This is poetry for the rest of us, the reachable, understandable, digestible poetry.
That night, Zapata washed my feet. Handlebar whiskers scratched the itch between my legs like myth.
On the days of our births, we breathe the dust of these memories, and it scours our flesh, smooths our skins, fills our lungs.
All the dead desire most is to live in our memory. All they desire most is to laugh and to dance.
I'm here with my guest, Katrina Crespin. Katrina is a mover and shaker in the New Mexico poetry scene, a Swimming with Elephants publication guru, a teacher of English, a doggy sitter, a poet, a poetry pusher, and has been a slam coach in the past. She's published several collections of poetry, and did I miss anything?
I don't think so. Maybe
You're kind of all over the place.
I know. Maybe edited anthologies for both students and grown-ups.
All right. And then, as with everybody else, if you want to start by reading a poem of your choice so we can all get to know you.
Okay. So this is a poem that I decided to do because it's not in any of my books.
Nice.
But it's in this anthology. That'll happen a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Poetry didn't save my life, but we did swim naked together in the lake up north one sunny afternoon when we thought no one was looking. And we've been caught more than once sharing a cup of bitter coffee and overly sugared pie at all-night truck stops off the highway along the hours of 1 a.m. She brushed my hair the morning of my grandfather's funeral and helped me stitch ripped skin and scrub spots of teenage blood from the carpet before I was old enough to know better. She sang with me in the passenger seat on the drive from Bakersfield to Porterville when the string of spotted horse raced alongside us over the golden hills. She's the one who threw the jawbone of the dead rabbit at my windshield. No, poetry didn't save my life, but I've watched her save others. She pulls bodies from the snow, throws a line if they can't reach her fingers, and leaves them to sleep it off on my living room couch. Just as I bring as many as I can gather, strap tall atop the hood of car, and drag through still-burning field to her door. I pass her gospel, the most diligent of missionaries. We are sisters, lovers, playmates, co-conspirators. We stand on opposite sides of the same bed to balloon sheets and straighten comforter. She encases my body with both arms and recites where the wild things are as she rocks me to sleep long after the boys are gone. We are intertwined. Blonde streaking brown more discreetly than the white of time, she resides nestled under skin, inside bone, tangled inside every vein of my forearm, knotted into bent knee and calloused feet. And late at night, she whispers her stories in my ear, seeds I scrawl to page before they slip back into the sheets. I repay this kindness by humming incantations in the cadence she taught me, in every word I write, in every sound I utter, across every mile I travel. And when she outlives me, as all revered loves do, she will miss her cockeyed collaborator and rhapsodize eulogies when no one remains to listen. She didn't find me, resurrect me, breathe life back into me. We've always been together, here, one.
Nice. I love it.
Thank you.
And I have to ask, why did you feel the need to kind of open it with poetry not saving you?
So I think it's kind of been a theme definitely for a lot of the people I know through performance poetry as well as students, this concept of poetry saving you, this poetry being the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that's true for a lot of people. And when I was exploring it, I realized that wasn't necessarily true for me, because I've always been a writer. Since I was a young child, I always have written poetry. I've always written stories. I've just always been writing. So I didn't really have a moment in my life where I was like really down and, oh my God, poetry brought me back. It's just always been there. And it was actually a response, that poem, it developed, of course, but it was originated from a prompt of, let's all write about how poetry saved us. And during that prompt, I was like, well, I didn't really have that one pivotal moment that so many people did, and those moments are important and wonderful, but my own personal experience was that it was always there. And yes, in hard times, it was always something that I would turn to and find comfort in, and definitely something that I would bring to other people. But personally, it wasn't like, and then I discovered poetry. I feel like poetry's always been with me. So that's sort of what that poem represents, the idea that, for my story of poetry is that it's always been a part of my life. It's always been with me. Hard times and good times, it's been there. And I suppose in that regard, it has saved my life throughout my life several times. But there was never that one moment of, I don't know, recognition or realization. It was just always there.
Yeah. And you mentioned that this was a prompt. If it was in a classroom setting, did you have to share it? And if so, what was the reaction?
Honestly, it was so long ago that I don't remember. I don't believe it was in a class. It wasn't in a classroom setting. It was in a workshop setting. So it was with other people my age, as opposed to working with students. And I can't remember if I shared it at the time or not.
Right. I was
I
curious.
probably didn't, to be perfectly honest, because I'm always intimidated when I write something that's different than the popular perspective.
And that's mostly why I asked, because it seems like that could go either way in terms of
Definitely
folks hearing it.
Yeah, definitely. And I remember performing it at a show once, and the next poet who came up after me was Will Gibson, and he said, that's a lovely poem, but for me, poetry did save my life. And he had a poem about that. And I was like, and that's awesome. Like, it's not meant to like disregard another person's story or experience. It's just my own personal experience.
Yeah, and it certainly reads that way as not being, hey, I'm better than everybody else.
Definitely not. Just my own story to tell.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up Will Gibson, because I love him
I
so
love Will
much.
Gibson, too. He's pretty rad.
And I did want to kind of start off by saying that I'm one of those poetry readers who kind of struggles to understand the more traditional stuff. Mm-hmm. I kind of got my poetry legs from the performance side, and only in the last couple of years. But that reading your book is much, it feels and reads much more traditional, but it still kind of readable, I guess. It's still, in all honesty, when I read your book, at least the one that I have, The Fall of a Sparrow, which I think is your more recent one, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have to say that it kind of reads to me like Margaret Atwood's poetry, who I really love.
I would take that as a compliment.
As
Thank you.
should, because it's almost like it. Yes, it reads very traditional, but I still understand it. But at the same time, I feel like once I'm done with it, I could probably read it a few more times and get a little something new each time. And I really enjoy that as someone who's not classically trained in reading poetry. So I wanted to actually ask you to talk about your style a bit, because I know that you've done performance poetry, you've coached it, you clearly do a bit more of the traditional stuff, you've been writing since forever. So talk about your style a bit, and maybe we'll start there and kind of branch out.
So definitely, first of all, thank you so much for that feedback and your interpretation of my work. A lot of times, a lot of people in my life aren't poets. So if I give certain people a poem to read, they're just like, oh, that's real pretty. And I'm like, but the theme and the nuance and et cetera. And they're just like, So thank you. I do really appreciate that. I am really classically trained, so I've been reading and writing poetry my whole life. I went to college and majored in English, and which is mostly the classical stuff when you're in college in the academic setting. And when I emerged from college, when I got my bachelor's, my writing was very academic in a lot of ways. I was very aware of meter. I was very aware of style, how it looked on page. And at that point, my experience with poetry was mostly on the page, was mostly reading, analyzing, discussing, experiencing in that regard, as opposed to performance. I actually didn't get involved or even experience performance poetry till about 2009. And I got my bachelor's in 2002. So quite a big span of working and writing and sending and getting and being published, sending out, submitting, things like that, before I ever saw anyone on the stage or took the stage myself. I began performing for the very, very selfish reason of my first book was being published. And I was, how else do you get people to know about your work than get up? I mean, this was, excuse me, when Facebook was first beginning, so I couldn't post things. I had to get out there and show people my work. So I started performing. And right away, the first open mic I went to, I recognized that what I was reading was very different than the other performance poets. And I was quite taken with the style of performance poetry that I was seeing, because it was freeing, it was different, it was emotional, it wasn't so focused on something minor. It had the a lot of times with performance poetry, it's not the words, it's the feeling that's instilled in you. So you might leave a performance not remembering a single thing they said or remembering just one line, but you're overwhelmed with emotion, you're in tears, that's the best thing I ever heard, I have no idea what you said. So there's a lot of emotion that's related in the performance aspect. And I realized that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to leave my audience full of emotion. I wanted them to remember and feel things that they might not have felt before, or might not even have been aware of. So that was one of the reasons why I began performance. I performed from about 2010 to 2015. Haven't really performed since last year. The Women's March was my last performance, as far as a performance poem went. And I really believe my writing, especially for that particular book, and a lot of the writing that came after I began performing, so after 2010, is kind of a combination of that performance aspect that I like and the previous academic training that I had. I want my poems to be accessible. I want people to be able to understand them on various levels. So the idea that you could go back to a poem and read it again and find something new, like, just tickles me, because that's my goal. My goal is like, yeah, you can see it in one way, but then you can also see it in another way, or you'll reread it and discover something you didn't notice the first time. That's how, in my opinion, good literature is. And, you know, when you're reading a novel, when you're teaching a novel, and different ideas and themes come out, that's what, in my opinion, good writing is, and I want to be a good writer. So the fact that you said that, I'm just like, yay.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to at least say about this book, and if we haven't said yet, you have at least 2 already, and then some in an anthology. But at least in this one, I think you said on your site that you were trying to build something that, one, you could read on a piece-by-piece level if you just wanted to open it up and read 1 or 2, or if you wanted to read it more as almost like a novelization of a life, that you could kind of start from the beginning and do it that way as well. I have to say you kind of did it on that, because that's how I read it the first go round.
I love you, because That was that was the goal for that book, and you're the first person who's actually said that.
That's so wrong that I'm the first.
Well, and I think, and again, a lot of my feedback comes from people who don't sit down and read a poetry book cover to cover. Even, my friends, supporters, they'll pick it up, they'll read a poem or two. But yes, with that particular one, I worked very hard on trying to create a story, trying to create a flow. Not exactly like, because I've read books, and like Ellen Hopkins is a very popular young adult writer. Are you familiar with her work?
No.
She does all of her stories completely in poetry form. So the book will be like that thick.
Oh, I've heard of it then.
Yeah. She's written a lot, and I really enjoy her work. There's another one called Brown Girl Dreaming that's written in the same way.
That's not true. I have read that. I love that book.
You have?
I have.
Oh,
I
yeah.
just didn't recognize the name.
It's
I
a
love
wonderful
that
book. And Out of the Dust, which is by Karen Hesse, I think. And it's young adult, but it's all told through poetry. And I was really taken by that form because I've been writing poetry for so long, but I like to read novels. I like to read stories. So the idea that you could combine those two was a goal of mine, and that's what I tried to create with The Fall of a Sparrow.
Nice. And then since we're chatting about it already, I'm going to ask you to read one from it. You're choosing. If you need my copy, that's fine.
I will need your copy.
But I'm curious about the name of the book and whether or not the sparrow was kind of already ingrained in a lot of the pieces, or if that was something you had to kind of weave in after the fact.
So the sparrow, I guess I was going through a bird phase. The sparrow was already there in a lot of the poems, and in a lot of the poems I gathered for the collection. There were a few, in a few poems originally, there were swallows for whatever reason, and so I did consciously change that to sparrows once I decided on the title. The first title was A Crippling of Sparrows, which I liked. I kind of wanted to go with that theme, but I eventually chose The Fall of a Sparrow for the Hamlet reference. I admit it. I love Shakespeare. I said it.
With that. And that's the other thing I dislike about not being classically trained in poetry. I rarely get the references.
Yeah.
So even like a lot of the metaphors, I had Christian on a while back, and
That's a great interview, by the way.
Thank you. One of my favorite poems of hers, at least from her little collection, is one that she talks about stopping and buying windshield wipers.
Yeah,
and I totally didn't get the metaphor that was playing out there. I felt so silly. But
you still were able to relate to the piece.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. As poets, when you put something out, it's great to be able to produce something that relates to different levels. So even if you don't get every intended metaphor, every intended idea, you still took something away. Everyone's different. Everyone who listens to poetry, reads poetry, is different. They're going to catch things, maybe things that you didn't even intend. And I think that's important to recognize as a writer, as when you put work out, and be okay with. Be okay with somebody looking at your poem and saying, I understood this, and you saying, oh, it was just about my dog. But if you got, the meaning of life, rad. Everyone's going to take what they want. And really, and this is something I kind of always told my students, but it is something I believe, once your work's out there, once it's published, it's not yours anymore. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the person reading it, and that person can do whatever they want with it because it belongs to them now.
Nice. And I appreciate your saying that, because I always fear asking a question about a specific poem. And I think I had Rich on, and it was his Formula 409 poem. And it's mostly a fun piece, but I felt like there were some nuggets in there that were more serious, and I was feared asking that question of like, oh, I see this thing really deep about life. He's like, no, it's just a funny story. So I always fear that I'm misreading things and fearful that I'm going to be like, oh, tell me about the depth of this. And it's like, no, it's about fortune cookies.
I think if you're paying attention, as a reader, if you're paying attention and if you're taking something, you're not misreading. I mean, again, maybe it doesn't match the author's intention, but it's still your interpretation, and that's valid. That's very valid, because that's what you take with you.
Yeah.
So,
I think, well, here's
Okay.
the book. I at least bookmarked one that I want us to chat about, if not read as well.
which one?
The poetry.
My kind of
poetry.
Okay.
But before I forget though, on that same note of reading poetry the way you want to read it, and I can't remember her name because somebody else introduced me to her, a quote unquote traditional poet, but the name of her collection is called Horses. It's like Joy.
Joy Harrow?
Yes.
Yeah. She used to teach at UNM. I don't know if she still does.
I don't know that either, but yeah, that's what I've been told, and I struggled with that collection because I like to feel like there was meant to be a purpose and story behind the poem, but then I later found out that all of those pieces in that collection were built and written so that it was basically something that the reader would take what they wanted from it, kind of like a Hello Kitty thing where she doesn't have a mouth so that the child has, whatever.
Has the voice.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, well, and I think it's the title poem, but She Had Some Horses is a really popular poem, I guess, especially in academia, or at least at UNM. And I personally always interpreted it as like her horses were like her lovers or her boyfriends or whatever. But there's obviously different ways you can interpret that. I mean, I've had discussions about that particular poem with people, and I think it's great to do. It's one of my hobbies. I love sitting around and analyzing poetry with people. Yes, I like Shakespeare, and I like to sit around and analyze poetry with people. I'm that person.
Oh, that's good to hear, though. Yay. All right, yeah.
Okay.
So
my kind of poetry.
yeah, and we're both coughing, so
Yeah.
you're just
Sorry.
gonna have to deal with it.
Just adjust this a little.
And Kat is knocking over things.
I normally never do that, I swear. Okay. Your kind of poetry arrives unexpected at my door, worn from the highway, trailing wet footprints across my Persian rug. Road-ridden poetry. Put away wet verse you scribbled over living room walls as they watch us pulse. I scrawl my kind of poetry all over your arms and chest, image heavy, dripping with metaphors you are free to interpret, free to wash away. Lousy poetry. 2 o'clock in the morning poetry. Dress you up in it so I can watch you take it off. You write your poetry all over my red sheets. Abrupt verbs, careless phrases spat inconsistently towards torso, too quick for me to catch. Heated poetry. Pull me close in the middle of the night poetry. Wrap me up in it just to feel it unravel. I leave my poetry unreadable on Sunday morning pages. Trivial lines and selfish verse residing in the cracks around your eyes. Soaked in solitude poetry. Illegible scribbles of the way the corners of lips haunt shoulder blades long after your silhouette deserts front porch.
Nice. And I don't even know why I gravitate towards that one. I think it's partially because the first time I read it, I kind of read it as just being about, I write the kind of poetry that nobody wants to hear, and that's just the end of it, the kind of off-the-cuff poetry.
Mm-hmm.
But like a lot of the poems in that collection, it's also got a very sensual nature to it, and even
It's a metaphor for sex.
Yeah.
Let's figure out.
After the third or fourth time reading it through, I finally figured that part out. But even some of the darker poems in that collection still have that kind of air of being, I don't know if light is the word I want to use, or not even sensual, but some sort of like still a very tender love involved in even the darker ones. So I don't really have a question with that other than to say yay.
I like the idea. I liked the word tenderness. I do think that, well, consciously or unconsciously, I think when you feel strongly about something, tender is a good word to describe it, whether it's sadness or joy or, when something's endearing to you. So I would love if people saw my poetry as tender.
Yeah. And another thing, since we chatted about this collection being also kind of a novelization of poems, I think it's in 5 parts. So can you actually talk about the parts, if you can recall?
Yeah, so what I try to do, it's in 4 parts.
4 parts.
And basically what I try to do, if you read it from cover to cover, is tell the story of a person's life, per se. The first part starts off very young, very naive. There's poems such as Childhood, First Kiss, Home. And by the end of the first section, there's the first loss as well. It comes to the last poem in the first section is called Your Cave, which is very much a poem about loss. The second section moves on to a more kind of mature time, maybe what you would refer to, what my friend Gina Marcel would refer to as the Your Salad days, which is also a Shakespeare line, because that's my life. Which is basically like a time of your life where you're silly and you're foolish, and there's a lot of love poems are in that section. Kiss, my kind of poetry, the one I just read, that's in that section too. But then there's also some really, again, it progresses as a story does, into some more tragic poems, I would say, some tragic ideas. Sun, The Walk Home, I Dreamt You, those are all poems about losing something, a tragedy. The third section moves more into maybe a more mature time in your life, but again, it's very heavy on losing a love, and I don't think that that's really a secret. Like if you're reading that section, it's definitely 2 lovers. There's definitely poems about falling in love and losing that love, and then the last one is a little bit about rebirth. Section 4 is a little bit about rebirth. There's poems like Phoenix, which you know what phoenixes do. So there's a little bit of rebirth, a little bit of maturation, new life, and then again, closure. I think the last couple poems, Thank You, Migration, They Don't Make Memories Like That Anymore, are very much about moving on. You might see that as a symbolic death of the character, or perhaps just a closure of that time in their life. That could, of course, be interpreted various ways. But yeah, just kind of a growing up and maturing, and then the time coming, the closure. But also, it's not all pretty. So in Childhood, in the first section, there's also death. In the second section, there's choices that need to be made. There's things that maybe are regretful, and there's loss. The third section, dealing with somebody who may have re-entered your life, that you might not know what to do with, perhaps. The fourth section, trying to kind of figure out what the purpose is and where you stand in all of it. My goal with this book, with most of my writing, is for people to be able to relate to it and to see themselves in it. So again, whether they're getting something that I implied, that I intended, or something more that they're reading on their own, that's the goal. I want them to be able to relate to it. Sometimes I've been accused of being vague in my poetry at times, but it's intentional. I want a man or a woman to be able to look at my poem and relate to it, or anything in between for that matter, whatever your spectrum is. I want people of all ages to be able to read it. I want it to be accessible to a teenager. I want it to be accessible to someone in their 80s. So being able for my poetry and my writing to be relatable to any audience is really important to me. Yeah. I don't want to exclude people with my writing, I suppose.
And I have to say, for a while, I was one of those people that didn't like the vague poems. Again, going back to horses, just because I like having a little direction and being guided.
Sure.
But after kind of reading Joy's horses again, and then reading through this again, I've kind of come to appreciate it a bit more. So I can easily see the argument of, oh, you're being too vague, but I kind of like it now. I never used to.
Well, I think as a reader, it gives you freedom. As a not so much as the writer, because it's actually, in some ways, it's harder to write. It's harder to portray emotion and ideas without being completely concrete. But as a reader, it gives you freedom and accessibility towards that piece of writing, because I can read it and relate to it if I'm not, X, Y, and Z, what that poem's about. I can, I have this ability to interpret, and there's a little bit of freedom there for the reader.
Yeah, and that's weird because a lot of folks talk about poetry as you have to be very specific, you have to be very fine-tuning, and it's kind of weird to talk about poetry in terms of making it deliberately vague in certain ways so that it's reachable and kind of relatable from any perspective, but still really encapsulating.
And I think, I've definitely heard there's definitely some really wonderful poems out there that are concrete and specific. So I don't want to say there's one way that's better than another. It's just, for me, that's my goal as a writer. That's what I want to do. But there's definitely a lot of different interpretations out there, and not everything's for everyone. If you read a poem and you're like, it's too vague, or it's too specific, that's up to you.
Yeah, and there's no reason to apologize for your style or your poetry stuff, because that's kind of the reason for the podcast, is having all walks of life in, from Anna's erotic poems to
really hers are erotic.
Yeah,
I didn't.
She's probably the only erotic poem that doesn't make me uncomfortable all the time. There are a few that she still gets. Makes
I love
me
her
uncomfortable.
stuff. I'll be listening to her and I'll be so caught up and I'll be like, that's so great. And then I'll look over and there'll be like a 12-year-old sitting next to me. And I'm like, shh.
Exactly. But, so Anna's erotic stuff to the more traditional, to the more performance-based stuff. So I like having everybody on.
Yeah.
And actually, I still haven't had it yet, but Tanea Winder is coming on, and I love her stuff.
When is she coming on?
Well,
she doesn't live here anymore.
She does. She lives here and Boulder. She actually lives, right at the other end of Eubank.
Really?
Yeah, and it's actually a friend of mine, or a coworker of mine, who's also a friend, took a class with Tanea, and posted something about her on Facebook, and Tanea responded, and I loved the video of it, and I was like, I need to have her on, and she said yes, absolutely. And we've had to cancel like 3 times because the flu has gone through New Mexico 800 times over the last few months, and she is so busy. I think in the last month she's been in like 4 different states doing things.
Oh wow.
So we've had to cancel a bunch of times, but I keep getting excited because I never knew who she was and didn't know when she agreed to be on the show. And then I started looking her up and finding out
more of her stuff.
And she's got her own Wikipedia page.
That's awesome.
So I'm excited.
Yeah,
I think she's my new favorite poet of all time. Yay.
Wonderful.
So changing directions a little bit, not entirely, since we were just chatting about, having different kinds of poetry be your thing and how that's not a bad thing. So who are some of your influences? It sounds like Shakespeare's on the list, but
indeed.
Either classic, traditional, performance, any of the above, just so folks who may not know poetry as well as somebody who's classically trained.
Sure. So there's so many that have influenced me over the years. Yes, obviously Shakespeare. I've been reading Shakespeare all my life. One of the biggest traditional ones is also T.S. Eliot. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is one of my favorite pieces of all time. It's a longer piece, and in 2012, I memorized it and performed it a couple times at local open mics and during Poetry Month. It was like a goal of mine that I've always had to have the time to do this, and I did it. It's something I've always been I've been proud of. But definitely those influences. But also on the other spectrum is poets like William Carlos Williams, who, if you're familiar with William Carlos Williams, writes very short pieces, very minimalist, and yet conveys a lot of ideas. And there's a lot of things you can take from a poem that's even that short. And a lot of my earlier work was very minimalist. Before I started jumping into performance poetry, and you had a 3-minute, you'd have to have your time. Even now, my poems are rarely 3 minutes. Like, I don't think I've ever gone over time in my life, maybe once. But I always was really drawn to this minimalist look. As far as performance poets, I adore Buddy Wakefield. One of my books has a poem I published that I believe I can't remember what I called it now, but it's kind of a response interpretation of one of his works that I adored. He's another poet that I memorized one of his poems. One of his poem, Horsehead, made a big impact on me, so I memorized that one and performed it a couple times, cover slams and things like that. Oops. I swear I didn't just knock the mic over again. Because I never do that. There's a lot of poems out there. I believe it's Stephen Crane. Oh, goodness. It's one of my favorite poems. And I believe it's called The Heart. And it's very short. It's, I'm going to misquote it here, but basically it's, no, I'm not even going to try to recite it because I'll butcher it, but I'll send it to you later.
Please.
It's one of my favorites. It's actually, because this is what a geek I am. I'm going to read it to you because it's the foreword of this collection.
Oh, brilliant.
In the desert I saw a creature, naked, bestial, who squatted upon the ground, held his heart in his hands, and ate of it. I said, "Is it good, friend?" "It is bitter, bitter," he answered. Nice. "But I like it because it is bitter and because it is my heart." That's the entire poem. It's just it's a short one, but it's one of my favorites. It's called In the Desert by Stephen Crane.
That's awesome. And that's in that anthology, which is called...
This anthology is called Catching Calliope. When I first started swimming with elephants, I had a quarterly publication called Catching Calliope. So winter, summer, etc. So this is winter 2014. It was the first edition of Catching Calliope that we put out. We only did it for 2 years. We did it through 2014 and 2015 because some shit went down.
Oh, uh-oh.
As you know,
uh-huh.
as we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
So my life took a different route, and I was not able to continue the publication. But there was 8 of them released before we stopped doing that. Yeah.
All right. And since that'll be a great segue into talking about swimming with elephants. So talk about kind of your role with swimming with elephants, as well as what it is and all of that, because we all love you here because you guys publish our stuff.
We do. We love poetry, and we love all different kinds of poetry. If you look at our catalog, we have all kinds from very performance based to very traditional to minimalist to poems that are 5 pages. I mean, there's just so much out there, and as a publisher of poets who are trying to get some recognition and their name out there, it's important just to look at all styles. Like, we're very much not exclusive. SWEP began in December of 2013, And it began because I and a couple other local poets who you know were very unhappy with their publishers. Before Swept began, I had 2 books published. They're now out of print. You could probably find them on Amazon, but they're no longer being produced. And I did not have a good experience with the publishing place that had taken my work. Another poet had a similar poor experience, and his work too went out of print. And they tried to rearrange his poetry, like just bad experiences. And then another friend of mine, who you also know, her initials may be JHL, wanted to put a book out because she was doing her tour. So basically, we had these bad experiences. Not Jessica, but me and Zach Kluckman, the other person, had these bad experiences with publishers. So I was like, you know what, I can do this. And I asked Jessica to be my guinea pig, and she agreed. And we put out the first collection from Swimming with Elephants called Cup Bomb.
I was just going to say, it's Cup Bomb, isn't it? So you basically just had to go for broke.
Yeah. I was like, why not? And there's a wonderful story that goes with Cup Bomb in the name and our collection on how to put it together. But different story for a different time, I guess. Anyway, that's what started Swept. After that, we did Zach's book. And after that, I believe we started doing the first collection. And then, of course, I did one of mine. And then we grew from there. So we just started putting more and more out and finding people. Matthew Brown, I believe, was our 4th publication.
He is my absolute favorite.
I love Matthew.
He's the first
Brown.
guy to make me cry at a poetry slam.
Yeah. Won't be the last. No,
No.
Matthew Brown's amazing. And that was kind of what I did because it was still very experimental. So I chose poets. I asked poets that I knew that I liked. I was like, I love your stuff. Let's put together a collection. And that was kind of the first year. Then we started looking for submissions. We started accepting submissions. We started putting together anthologies that weren't just the quarterly anthology, but thematic anthologies, such as Light as a Feather, which is about eating disorders, and Trigger Warning, which is subtitled Poetry Saved My Life, which is a collection of poems and short fiction or short nonfiction about that theme. So that it grew from there. And now we are doing yearly contest. No, I hate the word contests. I hate the word competitions too. Calls for work. We're doing yearly calls for work where people can submit, and we're picking the top 3 to publish. So that started last year, and Jessica Helen Lopez helped me judge. Actually, she was our guest judge for that competition. I hate the word competition. Poetry's not a competition.
Yes,
Shouldn't
slam
be.
isn't a competition, but it is a competition, but it isn't.
Yes.
You can enjoy it while it's still being...
There are many ways to enjoy it. But I don't like to think of I like to think of Swimming with Elephant Publications as a community, as different people who come together. I don't like to think of it as one author trying to be better than another. I mean, I think of all of our authors highly, and I think that they all work hard in whatever regard that they choose to work in. Anyway, Swept continued, and it continued to grow. We now have about 35 authors on our in our parade. I like to use the word parade. Elephants go on parade. And close to 50 publications. This year is also our 5-year anniversary. So we're having a big anniversary hoo-ha in November. And we're going to have some new announcements at that time. We're also rebranding, so I'm currently have a new logo being made, things like that. So when I started in 2013, I said I'd give it 5 years and see where it is. And I gave it 5 years, and it looks like we're going to continue for another 5. I'm big on 5-year increments. So 5 more years, we're in it. So we're going to do a little rebranding this year, get a few things made up and settled, and press on.
No, and I have to say that I have yet to hear anything negative about your press, and frankly, a lot of folks, like you said,
just
have
wait.
those.
Just wait.
I'm waiting for somebody to come on and talk trash about you. But no, nobody has. Everybody's come on and said great things, and even off the record. But yeah, you're right. A lot of folks do have some bad experiences elsewhere, and I find
it happens. I mean, it happens, and even a press with the best intentions. When I started, one of the things that, and pretty much anyone I worked with will tell you that I've said this to them, is it's your book. It's not, I mean, yes, I'm helping you publish it, I'm helping you put it together, but it's yours. You're the one who's going to have to sell it. You're the one that's going to have to read from it. You're the one that's going to have your name on the cover. What do you want? And by doing that, because that's what I didn't have with my publications, and a few other people, who I talked to didn't have. It's not about the press. We're a conduit. We're just trying. We're the connection. We're B when you're trying to get to C. So we're helping you along. But it's not about us. It's about you, the author, getting your words out there, creating an audience, and being part of something that's bigger than just yourself, I suppose.
Yeah, and I don't mean to say any of that to trash other publications. It's much more a testament to
oh yeah, no, there's great publishers out there, and there's far better publishers than me.
No,
I'll be the first to say it. We're a mom and pop shop.
It's a testament to how much you guys care about the folks that you work with, and I have to say that this podcast wasn't supposed to be much of anything. It was a couple of months of me chatting with my better half about, hey, this sounds like a cool idea. I can't find any poetry podcasts that I like because it's either so traditional that I don't understand what they're talking about, or it's just slam, which is fine, but it's not everything I'm interested in. And she says, well, just do it. And I mentioned it once on Facebook, and you said, oh, we're having this big party thing of 10 poets of ours doing short readings. Come.
Yes.
That day I had 10 interviews lined up.
Yep.
And I did not expect that.
Yeah.
And also the first person
and half of them probably actually showed up, right?
Yes, at least half showed up. At least half have shown up. But that made me happy because I'm not one of your publication's poets, but yet you still embrace it. It's an embracement of poetry in general.
Yeah.
And I have to say both that and the first person to say yes, Gina, was so excited. It made me a little weirded out just because I'm not used to being the center of attention. She grabbed me by the arm and dragged me over to you. She's like, Kat, guess what? Rainey wants me on his show. And I still haven't had her on because she said she has another book forthcoming. And
she does.
Yeah.
Hopefully this summer. She's also super busy. I know she's moving right now. So she has some things going on.
Let's see here.
But that's the thing. I mean, even the poets, and you'll see, I mean, if you like the Swimming with Elephants page, even poets who are not part of our parade, if I'll share their work, if there's a poem I like, I'll share it. The majority of quotations we use on that page are not our poets. It's about poetry being accepted and embraced and bringing more people to poetry, not these are our 10 cool people and you can only be one of these 10 cool people. And if you're not, we don't care what you think. I mean, it's trying to get the word out for everyone. I mean, I definitely promote events that I'm not part of, that I'm not even going to go to. But other people might want to go to, and other people might want to be part of it. So, I mean, that's just what we try to do.
No, and I'm glad. I know most of us in the poetry scene here in Albuquerque and outside of Albuquerque are really happy that you guys kind of embrace us as a community rather than just a bunch of people to make money off of.
Trust me, no one's making any money in poetry.
Never. So then that's actually a really good segue to this question. Why do that then if there's really not a lot of money involved?
Kind of for the reason I stated earlier, because I want people to embrace poetry. I want people to feel the power of poetry, to read poetry, to listen to poetry, to have their lives changed by poetry. It's kind of like, I'm not sure. I mean, in the poem I started off with, the poetry didn't save my life, there's a line that says, I pass her gospel, the most diligent of missionaries. And I really feel like, not necessarily in any kind of religious way, but that idea of, I want people to believe that poetry is a cool thing, to put it simply, to be able to relate to that. I think that it can have a great force in a lot of people's lives, and I know not everyone likes the same thing, which is why we have such a variety, but it's getting it out there and showing people that, I don't know, there's beauty in the world.
Now I know why you do so well with poetry here. You are such a cheerleader for it. I love it. I'm just going to have you come on all the time and start off with, poetry is awesome.
You're just saying that because I brought my pom-poms.
I am. And you brought me socks. Nobody knows this on the podcast yet, but I have a problem with socks. And it's mostly actually because my last job, I used to dress rather funky, to say it the least, but I had to dress nice. And so I had to find an outlet, so I started wearing fun socks.
Sure.
And then it exploded into everybody getting me socks for Christmas. So every year it would be like 20 new pair of socks. And then people would start getting angry because there'd be duplicates. And so now it's this big thing of, my better half a couple of years ago said, I'm going to find you a pair of socks that you cannot match to a shirt. And she bought these hideous, like 1970s curtain like paisley shiny socks. And I went into the closet and found this shirt, and I swear to God, I came out and she's like, I am so proud of these. And I went in and I came out, I was like, booyah. And she got so mad. But anyway,
goodness.
Yes, she brought me elephant socks. So, yeah.
And I mean, if on Facebook you're on like day 50 of a different pair of socks,
55 today.
55 today. Congratulations. I actually wore my Argyle socks.
Nice.
In celebration of you.
Yeah.
So, usually I'm just a white sock person. So.
Nobody should be a white sock person. Let's see. Before we do a last poem, anything else you want to chat about before we kind of close things out?
I don't know. I do want to thank you for having me and for this opportunity. And it's nice to be able to talk about my work. Usually I talk about other people's work. As a publisher, I spend a lot of time editing and discussing and analyzing other people's work. So being able to talk about The Fall of a Sparrow, which I haven't talked about in a while, and share some of my other stuff, as the poet in me really, really appreciates it.
And we do too.
Thank you.
Then let's hear one more of yours, and then we'll get to our icebreakers.
So I wanted to read the other poem I wanted to read, and I didn't bookmark it because that's the kind of person I am, I guess. But it's from my collection called My Verse, from Swimming with Elephants Publications. Shocking, I know. But it's called Stillness. I stayed until the clouds came into your eyes. Your body still too warm to convince me it was only a shell. Although a chill has yet to set into bones, a placidity enveloped around you more securely than my arms ever could. It is earth-shattering. It is a broken rib sticking its shards into my lungs. If I believed in heaven, perhaps I could accept you fled to a better place. If I believed in a God, perhaps I could find comfort knowing you are at peace. As it is, I know only you're gone. There was a time I wanted to name all the trees after your kindness, count the leaves on my stretched fingers to remind you of how many days you showed me love. You healed scars strapped across my spine and allowed blackened feet to balance on railroad tracks. I was invincible in the reflection of your eyes. Now I stand alone beside breakable body, my finely woven plots riddled with holes, drowning in stillness.
Thank you. I think I say this at least once every episode, that I really, really just want to snap like you do at open mics, and I just feel I shouldn't, so that everybody gets to enjoy it on their own. They can snap on their own time, but I have to hold back.
Okay,
All right.
Restrain yourself.
All right, then. Well, thank you. Let's see. Icebreaker poem. Do you want to go first or second?
I like to go second. You go.
Okay.
I've read it now.
And we went back to the Senru poem, so basically a haiku that doesn't need to talk about nature. And mine is Ex Machina Death. Nobody sees it coming, but we all cheer in the end.
Yay. Mine reads, twice this week, one more than last, the house we built shook but did not collapse.
Nice. Yay. So, Kat, thank you, and I will put links for all of your stuff and Swimming with Elephants
Wonderful.
all over the place.
Wonderful.
Because we love you.
Yay.
And thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This was lovely.
I want to thank Katrina Crespin again for being on the show. She really is a great poet, but she supports poetry of all styles throughout New Mexico, and I'm sure I'm not exaggerating this when I say that the poetry community here could not be more grateful. You can find Katrina all over the place, mostly under her maiden name when it comes to her poetry, under Guarascio, Katrina K. Guarascio. I will put the spelling and everything in the notes and all over the Facebook page. Links to her collections, either it be The Fall of a Sparrow, My Verse, and September Traces of Letting Go, also in the notes and all over Facebook and at swimmingwithelephants.com. If you want to be a guest on the show, you can hit me up via email at rainy.mullen@gmail.com. That's rene.mullen@gmail.com, and on Twitter at Pen and Poet, on Facebook, anywhere you can find me. Thanks again, and stay safe.